What is up, plant people? Hey, today is a Tuesday, the 17th of August, 2021, and we're back with another episode of the Planthropology Podcast, the show where we dive into the lives, careers, and general awesomeness of some really cool plant people. I am Vikram Baligia, your host and humble guide through the leafy, sometimes invasive sciences. How's it going today? Y'all doing good? I hope you are. I don't know what the world is like in your part of the world, but we're about to start school, and we're still in the middle. You know what? I'm not going to talk about it. It's gives me anxiety. But school's starting next week. I have 153 introductory horticulture students this semester, so they just don't even know what they're in for. So if you've been listening for a while and you happen to know one of these poor, impressionable young people, you should apologize in advance to them for me. Hey, we got a good one today. This is one that I've been trying to do for a little while. And my guest is just the most wonderful person. And I've heard her on the Just the Zoo of Us podcast. We've been Twitter friends for quite a while. But Emily Bell works with the Extension Service in Florida, and she'll tell you more about that here in a minute. But she specializes in studies in invasive species, which I think is such a super fascinating topic. And she is a self-identified fellow plant nerd. She is an avid outdoor enthusiast. She's worked in Florida, where she lives, in Hawaii, and all kinds of other places, and just has some really cool experience and some really interesting, fascinating, and important thoughts on ecology. And I know you're going to love this episode. So I don't want to belabor this too much more, but go do the things that I always tell you to do. Follow Planthropology on all the social media places: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Look for Planthropology. Look for the bristlecone pine, and that's me. Also, you can find me and whatever was left of my self-respect over on TikTok at the Plant Prof. But without any more ado, because I really want to get into this one, here is episode 55 of the Planthropology Podcast: Invasive Species, Biological Control, and Russian Shill Bots, with my dear new friend, Emily Bell. All right. Well, we are back with another episode of Planthropology, and I'm really excited about this one. This is one that we've been trying to coordinate for a while, and I kind of dropped off the face of the earth for a while towards the end of the semester. And so, like, this one, along with two or three of the recordings around it, like, I'm pretty sure I tried to start scheduling, like, in March or something. And then finally, I'm getting to where I can do it. But I have with me Emily Bell, who is the Florida Invasive Species Partnership Coordinator associated with the University of Florida Extension. And we're going to talk invasives and plants and all kinds of stuff. And I'm so excited. How are you today, Emily?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm so excited also. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So I don't know why I've started like talking about the weather at the beginning of episodes. And I think it's because there's another podcast I listen to called This Week in Virology, which, if you're out there listening and you want to know about, it's such a good show. But they always start with like a weather report, and somehow that got in my mind. So what's the weather like in Florida?
So I'm in Northeast Florida. I think when most people think of Florida, South Florida is probably the most iconic. But I actually live up kind of right near Georgia on the East Coast, and it's hot and humid, and we are fully into our rainy season. So we get some nice afternoon thunderstorms just about every day. We've already had one tropical storm kind of move across the state, so that gave us a good bit of rain as well. So hot, humid, and rainy. It's typical Florida summer.
I was in Tampa, 4 or 5 years ago for a conference in like October. And
Yeah.
and by October here where I live in West Texas, it's cool. We're back in the 70s during the day. We don't have humidity. It doesn't exist here. So I packed like normal, like, oh, I need a suit. I need all these things. And I walk outside on the first day of this conference. I'm like, I'm going to die in this suit. Like, it was
Yeah.
so hot.
Well, in Tampa, even, it's kind of south central. You're starting to get into central Florida. But here in Northeast Florida, we get winter, but October is variable. It really depends. We have really cold Octobers, and we have Octobers that are still like summer. So
Okay.
we are up here November, December, January, February. It's chilly, it's cold. more so than Central and South Florida. But yeah, it's very variable. Even in winter now, we used to get pretty cold winters up here, but even now, what we've been having more of lately is just like we'll get a little cold snap that'll last a few days, and then it'll be back in the 80s for a few days, and then it'll drop into the 50s again, and it kind of just does that until it heats up again for good.
And for those of y'all listening, like I have an ulterior motive with talking about the weather and about different locations and different climates. We're going to talk about invasive plants and some other things, and climate plays a huge role in where plants are invasive and all that. We'll get back to that a little bit later.
Totally.
But why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more? Tell us about, where you grew up, what you studied, how you got to where you are.
Sure. So I've been thinking about this because like I've been listening to the podcast, and I know folks talk about that and where to start. So I'm a Florida girl. I was raised here in Northeast Florida on Amelia Island, just a little itty bitty town just north of Jacksonville. So people kind of know Jacksonville. It's big and sprawly. So I'm just to the north of that in a small town, and both of my parents are foresters, and so both went to the University of Florida, graduated with forestry, and so I have to kind of give both of them a shout out for just even kind of what I've done with my career. In that, my mom was at the time in the mid 70s, I think, one of the only two women in the forestry school. So
Wow.
she was like, badass forester,
Yeah.
worked for a local forest industries here in the southeast U.S. and basically went as far as a woman was going to go, and broke off and did her own consulting from there. And then my dad was in forestry and timberlands, and then kind of transitioned into the sales component of the company that he worked for.
Okay.
And he was somebody who was really passionate about the environment as well. And oftentimes, especially, I think it's gotten better, but especially when I was growing up, there was kind of this timber industry bad, environmentalist good, and they
Right.
didn't really, meet, right? And so he was really passionate about bridging those gaps. So he would, join the local environmental organizations. Once he got into the land sales part, he did a lot of work with the state legislature in getting and with researchers on where lands needed to be conserved and where the overlap with some of the timber holdings were, and getting some of those lands into conservation. So he did a lot of work with that. So yeah, just two really strong, advocates for being outdoors, for learning about plants, obviously,
Yeah.
and so, and then also just our whole family grew up between here and also spent a lot of time on the Swanee River in Florida, which is more kind of still North Florida, but kind of in the central part of the state. Really beautiful, kind of unseen Florida, the part of Florida most people don't really know so much about, but should, because it's incredible. And so I went to the University of Florida and was going to be a biology major. Was like, yeah, I wanted to be a marine biologist. That was like my
Okay.
thing I was going to do, right? I was really into whales and the ocean, um, and kind of got my butt kicked a little bit with the math and some other things, and was like, maybe this isn't for me. What am I going to do? And I want to be careful here when I talk about this because, like, if people want to go that route and they get into it and it's a little hard, but you're still super passionate about, like, do it. Like, I could have probably overcome some of that stuff, but there was a lot going on transitioning into college, and I basically took the course catalog from the University of Florida and just read it cover to cover. I'm like, okay, what can I do that will keep me in school, keep me engaged, and
Right.
I can actually kind of succeed at and feel like decent about myself as. So I landed on anthropology. And so my background is social science. So I did a dual anthropology sociology degree as my undergrad. And then finished that up, and again was like, all right, now what am I going to do? Was interested in grad school, but had too many interests, like couldn't narrow
Right.
it down into one thing. So I kind of came home and puttered around a little bit. I actually worked for my local animal control organization because I was really passionate about, like, I'm really into dogs, and wanted to help in that realm. And so I did that for a little while. And also kind of just went back in high school, I worked in restaurants. So I went back and did some of that just to, have some income. And then I thought, it would be neat. It'd be cool to be a park ranger. And so I just started applying for any park ranger job that came available in the state of Florida. And this is where kind of my career path got defined by a really lucky break, which is that I got an interview at a place called, and buckle up for this one, the Guantanamo Matanzas National Estuarine Research Reserve.
Wow.
So, what was cool about that is Florida has a state park system, and it's really incredible. It's really vast, and park rangers a pretty ubiquitous job at these state parks, and it's a pretty well defined role of what you do, and it's a cool job, but it can be tough. It's demanding, and you're working in the elements. But this National Estuarine Research Reserve, so it's a NOAA state partnership, and there's 28, there might be 30 now in the nation. Hawaii was in the process of getting one. I'm not sure where that landed a few years ago. But so, anyways, any coastal areas with estuary, they have these national estuarine research reserves, and many of them combine different parcels of land with different agency management. And so this particular place used to have a state park component. And when it became a NER, the state park turned over its management to the NER. So anyways, the way that this shaped my career is that the National Estuarine Research Reserve not only had that land management component, so I came on as a park ranger, I got the job there as a park ranger, but they also had education and social science components. So every National Estuarine Research Reserve has something called the Coastal Training Program, which is built to take the research. So there's three primary components of the research reserve. It's the land management, it's the research. So they partner with universities and they have their own research section. And then they have the education component. And so the Coastal Training Program is intended to take the research that comes out of all the partners in the reserve itself and translate that information for decision makers. So those decision makers can be anyone from homeowners to your elected officials to businesses. So really what it winds up being is, you're doing a lot of workshops and program coordination and bringing people together to collaborate and create partnerships. So starting there as a ranger, getting really good experience for the first few years doing the on-the-ground field work. In school, I had taken some natural resources. I was really interested. A big part of my anthropology studies was how people relate to the environment, because I did want to keep that component, of my passion about the environment in there. And so I had a basic, understanding of the systems, but just got such good experience working on the ground and in the field, and then was able to transition because of my background into the coastal training program. And so, gosh, I guess I should rewind for just a minute. One thing I had been doing before I started at the NER was actually my dad introduced me to, at the time in Northeast Florida, we had a Nature Conservancy office. Unfortunately, we no longer have an office here in Northeast Florida, but he introduced me to everyone in that office, and I did an internship for them, which was developing a survey for the land managers in the region on invasive plants that they were dealing with to try and prioritize control strategies, and what plants were maybe incipient populations versus what is widespread. And so I had done that as well. So I kind of had gotten my feet wet with really focusing on invasive species issues, which is what kind of drew me into that world. And then, so when I got into the coastal training program, and my big, mission was to help translate science and actually have that science be used to implement change, I knew a lot about invasive species. So I brought a big invasive species component into that program.
Okay.
Did that for a number of years, and then got a really incredible opportunity to go out to Hawaii and do some strategic planning for the Hawaii Invasive Species Council. So that was really cool, really incredible just to learn. Hawaii and Florida actually have a lot in common when it comes to invasive species, but also there's obviously this whole other host of issues related to the Pacific Islands and what they deal with. So just really amazing opportunity, got so much out of that. But ultimately, again, I'm a Florida girl. I really just was homesick and missed it, and came home and did some stuff for a little while. I took a little bit of a break from the just invasive species is a big issue, and this can be really exhausting when it's all you do day in and day out. And so I took a little break from that, did some other stuff, and then this opportunity to work with the Florida Invasive Species Partnership, which is what I currently do, came up, and took that because it really tied in basically everything I had done to this point. Gave me an opportunity. I'd done a lot of regional work in Northeast Florida. Gave me an opportunity to really bring that work statewide. So gosh, that's it in a nutshell. Sorry, that was a lot
No,
to
no.
revisit any of that, but that's basically my path. Never went back to school.
Okay.
I work with a lot of masters and PhD folks, but I just worked up through experience and watching other people do things and learning and soaking it up and being like, I can do that. As when it comes to like meeting facilitation and coordination and bringing groups together and stuff like that.
Well, and I think that's really a fascinating story. I'm thinking through all of that because I do have questions for sure. But no, that's an important message that like, gosh, I'm in the academia world, so I get stuck sometimes in the mindset that, oh, go back, get another degree, do another thing, study more, spend more money, all that kind of stuff. Gosh, you don't have to. Like,
Yeah.
you can do what you love. Like I mean, yeah, having a bachelor's degree and especially in anthropology, I mean, clearly I think it's fascinating, but like, I think we put ourselves in like shoe boxes a lot. Like, this is what I studied, this is what I do, this is what I have to do. Right.
Hmm.
And life's not really that way. I mean, really, so my wife has a degree in wildlife science and wildlife and fishery. She studied more like collections and management and stuff like that. Now she is the education coordinator at a science museum here in
Yeah,
our
that's so
city.
cool.
And someone asked her one time, like, "Are you using your degree?" And she says, "Sort of. Like we deal with animals, we deal with collections, but we both grew up here. We've known each other for our whole lives, and even as kids, I remember her talking about." Like, we would go to this museum that she works at, the Science Spectrum, and she would
Oh,
always
that's
talk about
awesome.
how, "Oh, I would love to work here one day," even as kids. And like, you can find, and you said, you wanted to be a biologist, and you're working in biology, uh,
Hmm.
and you kind of took the road around all the math, and I'm kind of jealous of that. I kind of love
Yeah.
that, actually. um,
So, what's really incredible about what I do and what I've done in my career is that, and now, so the other part of what I do now is I help coordinate statewide invasive species efforts within the University of Florida's extension, IFAS, the Institute of Food and Agricultural
okay.
Sciences. That's our extension branch. And so it's it's the closest to academia I've ever been, for sure, because most of my work has been more with agencies and organizations
Sure.
and nonprofits and stuff. But the coolest thing about what I do now is that I have had the opportunity, because I'm somebody who you bring in when you need a meeting facilitated amongst different partners to get to a specific outcome or to get specific information together, or somebody who, with my experience, has been, keeping partnerships together. So coordinating the meetings that we have and making sure that people get something out of them. So they want to stay engaged in whatever it is we're trying to do. Um, and so, with that skill set, I have gotten to be in the room with some of the coolest people and the coolest researchers and the coolest and so I think if there's a message in the type of work that I do, and you can do what I do and go through and get a PhD and all of that, and I have total respect for people who do that, but um, that skill set is so needed amongst people who are the researchers and who are so deeply ingrained in whatever their one subject may be, because they need people to come in and say, okay, well, how can we apply this?
Hmm.
Or how can we bring you into this other group that's doing similar work and work together to maybe be more effective or to have more resources? And so yeah, I mean, the people that I've gotten to work with through this, and then I get to learn about all these different things, right, that these
Yeah.
researchers are doing. So that's by far the coolest part of my career, is that I've had the opportunity to be sometimes a fly on the wall, sometimes an active, facilitator or participant now, because I do have quite a bit of experience with some of the biological stuff. But yeah, it's been incredible in that way.
That's so cool. And I spent some time with extension as well doing that kind of stuff. And so like there is a special place in my heart for doing like a general I'm trying to think for the best way to say it, like general approachable science.
Hmm.
And as I got back into my PhD, it's like spend all your time focusing on this one thing, right? Like you just and you said this, like you pour everything into one thing, and sometimes we kind of lose the forest for the trees a little bit, and I think that that is such, like you say, such a necessary role in any
Hmm.
science communication system. I talk about this a lot, but you kind of stand in the gap in that feedback loop,
Hmm.
right? People go and I mean, whether they know it or not, if you're paying your taxes, you're paying for science. Like whether you know it or not, or whether you like it or not, like you're paying for science. And sometimes, I say this a lot on the show, we don't give that product back to the people that paid for it, but you
Hmm.
do, and,
Yeah,
and I
we
love that.
try.
It's so cool.
And again, it's so important, that those people who do get really focused on one issue or one thing, like that research is so critical because we need to understand what's happening and how things are working. And, you know, so we need all those pieces, right? We need those
Yeah,
people who get super hyper focused into a silo and go, this is what I'm really interested in. But then
right.
you also need those people who can come and say, hey, check this out, work with these people, let's do this together, let's apply your research here. So yeah, it's all a big puzzle that needs to come together, and all the pieces are so important.
Well, that's super cool, and I think being able to view it through your experience in the field, but also through your studies in anthropology and social science. Like there is okay, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to make at least one person mad, and I don't care. I care a little. I do care a little. But like we've all met that person. And I think I said this maybe on a recent episode too. That is like the smartest human that knows all the things about a thing, and then they try to communicate that thing. Ugh, right? It doesn't like we've all had that professor, and that's not to
Right.
say that's not to call anyone out or anything. And I'm kind of joking a little bit, but I think being able to view sciences and the bigger picture of how we relate to those sciences through a social lens, through an anthropological lens, is so fascinating. I love that so much. That's
Mhm.
super cool.
Yeah, and I think it's getting a lot better. When I was coming up in Florida through like the Department of Environmental Protection here, who is the state partner for the National Western Research Reserve Program. Um, you couldn't, like, I actually got denied to go to a conference one time because they were like, this is too social sciencey. But what it was a NOAA social science conference. And so I feel like NOAA has been a real leader in some
Yeah.
of that. The National Park Service has really been a leader in a lot of that. But it's starting to, and even, there's so many good researchers. And I was telling you earlier how like I'm so new to Twitter, but there are a lot of scientists who are getting a lot better. I think it's
Yeah.
it's SciComm and that kind of stuff, and recognizing the need for it. So yeah, I think we're all coming together a lot better than in the past, and really just getting more recognized.
That's awesome. And that's really encouraging too. So I want to kind of to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit of subject matter. So you work with invasive species and invasive plants primarily. You said
Hmm.
you did have experience with animals and stuff like that. So okay, I have lots of questions and lots of directions I want to go with this. So I'm going to try to focus because this is something that I find really fascinating. And um, can you tell us what is the difference between an invasive species and a native plant?
Okay, so let's see. How do I want to approach that? Yes, I can. I think what I want to do is just let's talk about what an invasive species is. So
Okay.
let's define it in the simplest of terms, right? So essentially, there's uh, three. Oh my gosh, what's the word I want? Tiers that a species needs to hit to be classified as invasive. So we're going to say one, that it's non native to the area that it is in. And so here's where we get into that difference, right? And you have to be specific about that
Right.
because some things, even on the continent of continental US, there are things that are maybe invasive in Florida, but not in the Western states, right? The things that move that way. So it has to be non-native, and the definition we'll use for that, we use that classic definition for the continental U.S. of pre-European contact. But
Okay.
of course, we know even prior to that, things were moved around. But let's just use that as a benchmark.
Okay.
And there's some gray area. like with most of these things. So we'll acknowledge that there's some gray area there, but in most cases that works. So it has to be non-native. And the reason that's important is because we have native species that act as a nuisance sometimes in some situations, and we have to be able to talk about those a little differently. And we can get into that too. That's another tangent. So there's that. So the second one is it is a established and reproducing on its own without any assistance from people. It's out in the environment doing fine on its own. Kicking back to that first tier, I'll add that the mechanism pretty much has to be that humans introduced it. And that's important too for another reason we can talk about, which is natural species moving for other reasons, and even climate change. So it gets complicated. It gets great quick, but we can talk about some basic things. So number one, non-native and introduced by people. Number two is established and has self-sustaining breeding populations. Number three, it is causing harm to either or all of the above to human health, to the environment, or to the economy. So those are our three things that something has to hit, and then we say, okay, this species is invasive. And that harm is really the critical factor, right? Because we do have some things that are established that are non-native to an area, but aren't necessarily causing any harm. So, okay, we'll watch them. There's issues there too with invasional lag and things like that. But generally, did I muddy that up enough?
No, I think that was a very thorough answer, because we use that term a lot, and you see it a lot. We are friends on Twitter and on social media, and you see that all the time. Like, oh, this thing's invasive. I'm not going to get into the animal I was going to say, but these things are invasive and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to understand that words mean things. We can't, we throw terminology around, and it's like, anytime a word have you ever said a word so many times that after a while it just starts to not make any sense?
For sure.
And I think we get there with words like invasive. Like, okay, is this weed that's in my front flower bed that I don't want here, this dandelion or whatever, is that invasive? Well, yeah, I mean, maybe,
Right.
maybe not, probably not. But it could be,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is a very good, thorough explanation of what an invasive plant is.
And so one of the first things when I came on board with the UFIFIS side of my work, the university side, one of the first things the primary group that I work with did is we published a paper in the Journal of Extension on invasive species terminology to use with stakeholders, basically the general public. And so we identified 7 terms that we defined and said, here's what we should say. We also identify terms we want to kind of stop using when we talk about invasive. So one that has kind of mostly gone away but still pops up are things like alien, exotic. We want to be really clear in the terms that we use. And so that was in the Journal Extension. It actually has been really popular because I think there is such a need to say, okay, when we're talking, even in my definition, as I mentioned, things get gray real fast. And when we're talking to researchers and when we're talking to, in our communities of practice, we need to flesh out all that gray area and we need to talk about it. But when we're communicating with stakeholders who just want to know, do I need to pull this up or, just want to understand the basic issues that we're dealing with, we do want to have some really clear communication and be using the same words to talk about what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's really that's super important. And I wanted to give a specific example. We have I don't know if you have mesquite trees where you are.
No, but I've heard you talk about it.
Yeah, okay. It's an acacia. Now I can't remember what the scientific name is. It doesn't matter. Prosopis glandulosa, it doesn't matter. So yeah, they are. A lot of times people are in this area for some reason getting fights about the mesquite tree. It's the weirdest thing. This wasn't a native, and the idea that people throw around a lot is that it came up with the cattle drives. It's real common in South Texas, along the Mexican border and in northern Mexico. And so the idea is that, when cattle were driven up into our area, the mesquite was moved up here. And there are these scrubby little trees. They're the wood is beautiful if you can find a piece that's longer than like 3 inches long. Like they're these weird scrubby trees. And but there's an archaeological site here in the Lubbock area where I live, and they've dug up mammoth bones and all kinds of other stuff. But in that, they found charred remains and fossilized remains of these trees that they've carbon dated 4,000 years, 5,000 years. So things move into and out of ranges all the time. And so, yeah, having as much as it is hard to draw like a line sometimes and say, this is what it means, you kind of have to for the sake of clarity.
Right. And some things are very clear. Like most of the biggest invaders we deal with in Florida, we know where they came from. We know when they came in. We can pretty clearly say, this isn't native. This was brought in for this reason at this time, and now it's a problem. But we have our own version of that argument here in Florida with an aquatic plant called water lettuce.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a similar thing where I haven't dug. I've kind of, I see it and I'm like, okay, y'all figure it out and then tell me. But it's a similar thing where it's, some people consider it introduced, but then there's fossil record evidence of a similar species, whether it's the same or not, I think is some of the argument, but it's a very similar argument to what you're describing. So yeah, we have those gray areas. But again, most of what we're dealing with is pretty clear. But you get into, so the term that we use in our publication for natural, what we would consider natural species movement is range change. And so in Florida, we deal with that with things like coyotes and armadillos. So we didn't used to have those, we do now, but they kind of came on their own. With plants, we're actually dealing with things like mangrove migration north with climate change. And so we're seeing we're seeing our salt marsh line, which generally was around Central Florida into kind of North Florida. And on the West Coast as well, we're actually seeing both sides. We're seeing our salt marsh line decrease and as our mangrove line, our mangrove systems increase. And so there's a lot of questions around that because salt marsh is really important habitat. Mangrove is also really important habitat, but we're seeing this range change, and how we talk about that in the future is going to be important, but we're still studying it. We still need to know what the implications of that are going to be.
That's really fascinating because we don't know necessarily, right? When we're talking on evolutionary time or geological time with some of these like species movements, it's like, okay, well, maybe it's going to be bad. Maybe it's, we don't know. But
Right.
there are examples, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about it. I think there are a lot of cautionary tales when we talk about moving plants or moving animals from one place to another. I use the example of the cane toad in Australia a lot, of how, they introduced these 6 males and 6 females and they ate everything except for what they were supposed to. And now there's billions of them, they're everywhere. Go ahead.
So there's 2 really big branches to that discussion. So the one kind of that you're hinting towards with the cane toad example is this misunderstanding of biological control. And so there are these species whose introductions were intended to control something else that had gotten out of hand or control a pest or something like that. And there are these examples of things that were done in a not necessarily very scientific way that are often used to discredit biological control that's done in a very scientific way and is an important tool against invasive species.
Yeah.
And so I would say when we talk about cautionary tales, like, yes, it's important to bring those up and say, like, that was a bad idea when that was done. But also just before we really understood how these things could impact the environment, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was just this boom of bringing plants from all over the place to Florida. Also, so an example I can give from Hawaii too is that when it was, colonized, they basically deforested a lot of the mountains and realized that they created a huge environmental problem because they had mudslides and it was contaminating the water. And they're like, well, we got to reforest and we got to do it fast. So they brought in one of the world's fastest growing trees, albizia. The scientific name is escaping me right now because there's some different albicias. But they brought in this, I want to say it's from Africa, albizia. It gets giant. It's a huge tree. And it's incredibly invasive, of course, now. I mean, it's the fastest growing tree in the world, and it creates a lot of problems. It's really problematic with hurricanes because the wood is somewhat weak. It blows
Hmm.
over. When I was there, a hurricane hit the Big Island, hit the Hilo side of Big Island, and it was a really big hurricane. And it hit Hilo side, and then it essentially was diffused by the two big mountain peaks, so Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa. The storm dissipated, but Hilo has a ton of albizia. And honestly, had that storm hit and the natural environment been there, the natural like ohia forests that are supposed to be there, the economic damage probably would not have been as severe because a
Wow.
lot of the economic damage was from these giant trees going down. And so there's an example where they brought something in to reforest
Huh.
and it became a huge problem. But in Florida, we just have so many plants that were brought in that time period for just ornamental, like, hey, this is pretty, let's bring this in and plant it. One of the best examples, and my personal nemesis, is called the Brazilian pepper tree, Chinus terebinthifolia. It now covers over 700,000 acres of natural area in Florida.
Wow.
It's so bad, and we have some hybrid vigor going on. It's really problematic. And again, it was one of those introduced because it was pretty and planted. And so a lot of that was before we knew better. And so
Sure.
now what we have to do is take the responsibility to say, okay, when we want to bring something new in, let's make sure it doesn't have the potential to become invasive, right? So I think that is a lot of the cautionary tales is just, learning from our past mistakes. And the same is true with some of those quote unquote biological controls of the early days. And I say quote because, again, when we talk about biological control, we want to be really clear that what we do now and what has been done for, well over a few decades is very, very thorough research.
Sure.
Um, and we have some really big success stories with biological control that are important to share. And so, yeah.
No, and that is a good message to tell because I talk about ecology in my class that I teach, and I always talk about things like kudzu and cane toads and all of that. But I probably don't spend enough time talking about we do a little bit with some different biological control organisms and things, but I probably don't spend enough time talking about okay, these are problems we have, and then we did lots of research in science, and then we found things that do work, and so that's really a good message for me personally is that to work that in because we have to be careful in science communication in general and science education of trying to tell the whole story, right? And I think we
Mhm.
fall into that trap of especially if you spend time on Twitter and some other places, like it gets a little doom and gloom, you know and
Yeah.
and and there's I'm sure there are plenty of things to be concerned about. I'm not trying to downplay that. But we have figured out a lot of stuff too. We've done a lot of things that have made plant systems and ecosystems better and all of this. So like no, that's really good kind of feedback for me to think about the way that I approach some of these things too.
So we have a really big success story in Florida with a species called air potato, Dioscorea, I think pulpifera. I also murder Latin, so
Oh, I do
anyone
too.
out here who hears my Latin and
Oh
is
no, it
like,
doesn't
"That's
matter.
how
I
you
do
say
too.
it." But so air potato, it's this really aggressive vine. It's non-native. It's from Africa. It smothers, forested systems. It's really, really nasty, and it's really common in home landscapes too. So we have a lot of homeowners who are dealing with it. How do I get rid of this? Um, Gosh, how long has it been now? Maybe even 10 years. We found this adorable little beetle from its native range. It's this little red and black beetle, and it makes these cute little chirping sounds. And it's a specialist, right? So it only feeds and completes its life cycle on this species, and it has really helped. And that's the other message with biological control is typically it's a tool that's brought in when something is already widespread. So we probably should backtrack a little bit after this and go through kind of the phases of invasion. But
Okay, yeah.
this is typically used for something that's already widespread and out of control, and it's another tool for our toolbox to help manage. It's never something that's going to, well, it's very rarely something that's going to eradicate an invasive species, although there are a few small examples where it really did a number. But the air potato beetle was a really high profile, very visible example of something that came in and was able to reduce the potency or the vitality of this vine enough to help both homeowners and land managers bring it under control to the point where it wasn't just, running rampant the way it was before. So again, even this beetle, as effective as it is, not going to eradicate air potato from Florida, but very, and the people who released it, and University of Florida Extension did a great job with the outreach of it. They got these beetles into the hands of homeowners who released them in their yards, and there's great feedback, and it's just been an overwhelming success. So it's nice to have a story like that. I'm sorry if there's a dog toy.
No, it's okay. I'm shocked my dog's not doing it too.
It's nice to have a success story like that to share with folks and to talk about, and as a way to introduce them to biological control and say, here's the good side. Here's what, when it works, this is what happens.
Yeah. No, and that, again, that is a very important story to tell. So like you said, let's back up a step, because I think that is an important part. And talking about the phases of invasion. How does an invasive species get established as an invasive species?
All right. So I'll talk a little bit about just my experience with Florida and Hawaii. So I have worked in the two most impacted places in the country for invasive species. Florida is number 2, Hawaii is number 1. And a lot of that for Hawaii has to do with it being an island ecosystem. They're kind of the microcosms of environmental problems. Everything's amplified.
Sure.
And so, but Florida, for a number of reasons, some of it is because for both plants and animals, especially herpetofauna, we are a huge port of entry. So a lot of stuff comes in through Florida. And there's a lot of horticulture in Florida because of our environment. And so because our environment is so tropical to subtropical, things also really do well here when they escape that cultivation. They're like, oh, this is nice. I move in, I like this. And so there's a great image of kind of the invasion curve, as we call it. But essentially it starts with prevention. So how can we be on the lookout for things that are potentially coming in and stop them before they even do? So we've got inspectors, right? We've got people, we've got ag stations, we've got dogs sniffing luggage at Miami Airport in case you have an apple that might have a fruit fly that we don't want. Wow. And so we have systems like that in place. We need more. We call that biosecurity. Australia and New Zealand are great examples of really strong biosecurity policy. And if you talk to them, they'll say, yeah, because it got so bad, we had to. Right. And so, often people are like that, right? We don't really respond appropriately until it's so bad we have to. But so we have this biosecurity, and we need more support there. We need our inspectors and our programs to keep things out to be more robust than they currently are. But the people who are doing the work, they're unsung heroes. If you can get someone on from the Customs Border Patrol that do that side of it, the inspections, man, the work those guys are doing and the stuff they see, occasionally we get to see reports from either Florida or national about the interceptions, and it's wild, it's wild, especially with insects too. Okay. The interceptions are just wild. And so there's prevention. That's the best thing to do. Let's prevent it from coming at all, right? Yeah. The second step is early detection and rapid response. Okay, something has appeared. It has invasive potential. We know that from either it's already invasive somewhere else and we're aware, or, just run it through a check and oh, this could be a big problem. Can we contain it and eradicate it before it gets out of control? And so let me try to think of an example for that. I can think of the giant African land snail in South Florida. Okay. So that's been detected a few times. Anytime it is, eradication protocols go into place and it's eradicated. So that's really important, because that is the second most effective thing we can do, is detect it early and, get ahead of it and eradicate it before it becomes a problem. The next stage is establishment and essentially we go into what we call maintenance control mode, which is where a species is already so widespread, we no longer have the capacity to just, eradicate it. So we have to come up with what we call an integrated pest management strategy, where we find all the tools available to us and figure out the most economic, environmentally effective way to then tackle this thing and minimize its impacts on the environment, the economy, or, whatever it's impacting. Unfortunately, with so many things in Florida and Hawaii, we're already in that country. Like we have so many things that are just so widespread, and we're in that mode of, how do we either prevent it from spreading further? So for a lot of things, so in my area in Northeast Florida, we spend a lot of time looking to the north of us at like, okay, what's coming down from the north and
Uh-huh.
also to the south, because what's coming up from the south, and we're having a lot of issues with climate change, with a lot of things that have been typically restricted to South Florida. Now we have to look at them in North Florida and say,
Oh
okay,
wow. Yeah.
So we even internal to the state, we have regional working groups that consider species that are in Florida but not in their region as their early detection and rapid response, right? Because they're like, okay, this is really bad down there, but it's not bad up here yet. So anytime we see it, we need to nip it in the bud. Um, so yeah, we go through all those, and it gets really expensive. It gets exponentially more expensive to manage invasive species the more widespread they become. Unfortunately, oftentimes we don't even detect something until it is widespread.
Right.
And this is especially true with like insects. So a great example of this kind of thing that we can watch, you can kind of see a time lapse of how it happened, was the red bay ambrosia beetle. So
Okay.
there's this beetle that came in a port in Georgia in wood packing material from Asia. So it was living in the wood packing material from Asia. It came into this port and it escaped. And it likes laurel, red bay. Oh my gosh, what's the genus? I'm losing all my scientific names
Oh,
talking
it's
to
okay.
you. So red bay trees, we have a number of
Okay.
species in
Yeah.
Florida, are kind of a pretty staple tree for southeast forests. It's a predominant tree. So what this thing does is it has a fungus in its mouth parts that it releases into the tree, and then it rears its young on this fungus. But in our bay trees, it kills the tree. It
Sure.
just essentially chokes off that flow of water and everything from the cambium of the tree. And so this thing spread like wildfire. All of a sudden, we had this mass die off of red bay, and it was really obvious because you could drive through forests and just see. And it was a pretty quick die, so it was it's called laurel wilt. But you can, a tree will look healthy one day and just be completely browned out
Oh wow.
relatively quickly. And so, but still, we're watching this thing spread. And we have a avocado industry in Florida, and avocados are in the same family as our bay trees, and so they're starting to get hit. And this laurel wilt is moving west, it's moving north, and it's moving south, and it kind of radiating out from its introductory point. But that's a great example of something that, I mean, this beetle is the size of a pinhead.
Yeah.
So detection, we don't know until we start seeing mass die-offs of these trees. By that point, it's too late, and we're
Yeah.
playing catch up. We're like, is there something we can do? And so things like that are, how these things can start and just take off like a wildfire.
That sounds just like oak wilt in the state of Texas. It is the
Mhm.
same, pretty much the same disease and an infestation cycle. This little beetle goes and finds wound sites on primarily red oaks and spreads a fungus, and these fungal mats grow there, and it kind of smells like bananas, which is weird. And then attracts more beetles and all of that. And in Texas, we have. Oh, I don't know what the number is. I know in my town where I live, we're about 60% oak canopy in the city, which is not a super healthy urban forest. If like for folks that know anything about that, we need more diversity in that. But there's neighborhoods where like all the oak trees are gone. They've had to cut them all down because
Mhm.
there's nothing you can trench down the middle of the street and try to cut root connections, but there's nothing you can do.
Right, right.
And yeah, and again, prevention is so hard because it's spread up into our area on firewood because
Mm-hmm.
down in the
Don't move firewood.
exactly. Well,
Yeah.
because all these landowners, and it's not their fault. They didn't know. Like what we talked
Hmm.
about earlier, like there's unintended consequences. We don't know what we don't know.
Right.
But all these landowners in central Texas, where oak wilt kind of started, all their oaks died, and they were like, "Oh no!" So they sold the
Yeah.
firewood, and it got moved all around the state, and it's a big, big. I mean, millions, hundreds of millions of oaks have died. So yeah, prevention and we don't think about something as simple as, oh, I was driving through the hill country and there was a roadside firewood stand and it's
Hmm.
November, so I picked some up on my way home. We don't think about that.
And again, that's why I say, these inspection networks are so important and need more support than they currently have, because something like red band version beetle, came in on a crate, like in a wood crate. And there's actually a similar thing going on in Hawaii right now, called rapid ohia death. And ohia is it is the first colonizer of a like after a volcanic flow,
Hmm.
like after, it is the basis of most Hawaiian forests. And it's a very similar thing. It's an ambrosia beetle that is spreading this fungus and causing these die-offs of ohia, and that is very, has the potential to be. I kind of haven't kept up with it as well. It kind of was on. They were kind of just figuring out what was going on, when I left in 2015. And so they've been, researching it for a while now, and they have a better handle on what's happening. But it was first detected on the Big Island, and I believe now is on a few other islands as well. And so just these types of, insects especially can be so just devastating to forest systems so quickly, and they're so hard to detect until they are really widespread.
Right. Wow. So, I mean, it's a major issue. And I just actually looked up as you were talking, the ohia tree. It's a beautiful tree, and
It really is.
it reminds me of like a bottle brush or an
Hmm.
albizia, which is
Hmm.
interesting because they fill maybe a similar ecological niche. Unfortunately, in some cases, right? Like that's pretty interesting. Um, so okay, what do we do? We've talked about this some, how we can use different biological controls, different good IPM strategies to deal with invasive species. But ultimately, like, that's at maybe a governmental level or a policy level kind of thing, right? As individuals, what things can we do, or do you have a few things we could do to maybe help control the spread of some of these invasives?
Yeah, so I'm going to get into that. I do want to. So the albizia that was introduced to Hawaii is Falcataria
Okay.
genus. So it's not, because there are a lot of albizia genuses as well. So I just wanted to throw that out. So yeah, so there are a lot of things we can do on the individual level. Just getting educated about the invasive species in your area. So reaching out to your local extension, or, just, and this goes hand in hand with getting educated about the native ecosystems in
Yeah.
your area. So here in Florida, it can be really difficult because, like I said, I'm a Florida girl. Like, I grew up in the woods and the,
Yeah.
swamp and the ocean. And so, like, things like alligators and snakes and all those big scary things, those are my friends, you know what I
Right.
mean? And so, but we get so many people who move in and are terrified of these things and just want them not anywhere around them. And it's
Hmm.
like, on the one hand, you want to be like, welcome to Florida, it's beautiful here, learn about how beautiful it is. But on the other hand, sometimes I'm a little bit like, don't move here if you hate everything about the natural ecosystem. Like,
I really like that.
so, but so you kind of have to know what's supposed to be there to know what's not supposed to be there,
Right.
right? So learning about beyond just what the typical ornamental plants are in your neighborhoods. What do your forests look like? What do your wet areas look like? So just getting educated about what's in your area. If you see anything that looks out of place, report it to somebody. So in Florida, we have FWC. We have some pretty simple ways to report invasive species. There is an EDMAPS, so EDDMAPS, edmaps.com. That is a national website.
Hmm.
I'm not sure how we use it heavily in Florida, so I'm not sure how well monitored it is in other states. But again, extension is a great way to start, if you have a local extension in your county. But whoever your local environmental agency is, we have two in Florida. We have DEP and FWC. FWC, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, typically deals with the invasive species. But just tell somebody in that realm, like, hey, here's this thing. We have a lot of great examples where it was, just like a homeowner or a teacher or somebody who was like, this looks weird. And then we're like, oh yeah, that is, let's get on
Oh
that.
wow. Okay.
So people, everyone is our eyes and ears. Everyone is our first line of defense. Um, being aware of how not to spread them. So, like you said, firewood is a big one. Use local firewood. That's really important, especially nowadays. We've got more and more invaders. Excuse me, things like emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle,
Yep.
spotted lanternfly. Those are all things that are, I think, still primarily Northeast issues, but emerald. Asian longhorn beetle is now in South Carolina, so it's getting closer to us. So firewood is a big way, to move those things. But even when you're just out recreating, if you're a boater, a lot of aquatic invasives can hitchhike really easy. A lot of our aquatic invaders are actually reproduced vegetatively.
Hmm.
And so even if you just take a little bit of a plant, a little bit of root material, a little bit of something, and go to the next water body that maybe doesn't have that yet, and now it does. When you're hiking, clean your boots. A lot of seeds, even native species, it's really best to just not be moving things around to new places.
Sure.
So, cleaning your boots, cleaning your car if you visit a different area. And then, taking control of your own landscape. So a lot of the work we do has to do with helping to better connect and understand how natural resource management or natural resource managers are dealing with invasive species, and then connecting them with that private landowner just across the fence that may be a constant source of reintroduction of an invasive species. So anytime a private landowner can tackle them in their own property is really key. And then I'm a huge proponent of native plant landscaping.
Yeah.
So one of the ways to make all of our systems more robust to everything from climate change to habitat loss to invasive species is to provide more native habitat. So native landscaping, using native plants in your own landscape supports your native pollinators, makes the whole system more resilient. So I'm a big plant nerd, just like native plant nerd. I
You fit
spend a
in
lot
well.
of
Yeah.
my time out in the forest, just looking for what's blooming, and just really majorly geeking out with my sister-in-law. And so those are some of the biggest things, I think. And then just be an advocate, just, again, it's like I said, those folks who are doing inspections for species. And I think just learning about what's happening and being an advocate for those systems and those people is huge.
For sure. Well, no, and those are good, like really practical things that anybody can do. And I'm with you on the native, and I'll say native, and I kind of promote around here native and well adapted landscapes, because if we go with
Mhm.
native landscapes here, we got to go cut down most of our trees, and I don't want to do that.
I
But
know.
but yeah, no, I think that is important though. Like if there's a specific plant you want, there's also because a lot of people move, and they're like, oh, I grew up here, I want a
Hmm.
whatever, whatever.
Hmm.
You can probably find a native that fills that same niche in the landscape that
Hmm.
that meets your needs without
Hmm.
destroying the ecosystem.
Hmm.
uh but no, that's such an important message. Well, we'll start. Wow, I just looked at the time. This has been so fascinating. I don't
I
want to
know
stop
I
talking
could
to you.
do that. I could talk about this all day long if you can't tell. So in my mind, I'm trying to do, okay, did I hit the key points? What's super important? What I have to say? But yeah, I could just get lost in the sauce on this.
Well, we
So
may have to have you back on sometime then, and follow up. Maybe pick a specific species at some point and talk more
yeah,
in depth about it, because I think
yeah, that'd be
that's
cool.
helpful for context, right? I think that's really
Hmm.
helpful for figuring out, okay, if I can apply it to this one thing, then we can apply those principles elsewhere. Um, but are there any last points you want to make before we kind of wrap up?
I think I think for me, I want to talk just a little bit about just the people who do invasive species work, because it can be really difficult. And like you said, we can be really, it's really easy. And I think in any environmental field to get really doom and gloom really quickly. Um, but I see a lot of, hmm, I want to frame this in like a good positive way, but I see a lot of negativity towards when people talk about invasive species. One of the biggest things, one of the easiest rebuttals is like, oh, people are the worst invasive species. Like, I promise you, anyone who's ever worked on invasive species has heard that. And we know, like, we know.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and most of us who are doing invasive species work, I work in Florida, so I deal with plants a lot. I came up on plants, so I know the most about plants. But, of course, we also have here in Florida, we have the highest diversity of established non-native herpetofauna of anywhere in the world.
Wow.
So you can go to South Florida and basically go on a tour of the world's herpetofauna. Now, not all of those are invasive. Some of them are established in these little pockets and they're not necessarily doing any harm. But
Right.
then some of them, like, the famous python of the Florida Everglades and black and white Argentine tegus, and they are doing a lot of damage. And so, but these are things that I think are so cool. I mean, I love snakes. I love reptiles. I love frogs. We've got a number of invasive frogs that we have to deal with. And, I may have to go out and control an invasive frog, but that's not easy for me because
Right.
I still love this animal. And in its native habitat, like, I'm so stoked that it exists and I want to support it there. But I can't ignore that here it very much disturbs and is detrimental to the native species.
Yeah.
And so just that point that invasive species are actually, kind of in this triumvirate with climate change and habitat loss as the top 3 causes of extinctions globally. So, this really is a major issue. And I would say, if there's anything I could leave with people, it's like, before you go out and just like say, oh, all government agency work is bad, so you're a government agency worker, you must be doing something bad, or I'm suspicious. Get to know the people doing the work in your area.
Yeah.
We have organizations in Florida called the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Areas. And those are regional networks of the boots on the ground folks doing the work. And the primary function is for them to communicate and understand the issues in their region. But those are open to private landowners. I think it's so easy to cast, and especially in this age of kind of science backlash to a degree, for the most part, like the scientists and the resource managers, they want to talk to you. They want you to be engaged in the work they're doing. They want you to understand why they're doing it. And it's all really passionate individuals who want to do something good. And so I think my message is that, this is all people-driven work from people who really care and who are really passionate. And so if you really want to understand what's going on, reach out and talk to us and let's work on it together and not just be like constantly having this tension between, the issues.
That's awesome.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Oh, 100%. I work for Extension. I definitely know they don't, it's the people a lot of times think it's I'm from the government, I'm here to help kind of thing. And
Yeah.
but we're actually trying to help. We want to help.
And I guess, I'm sorry. And again, I could go on all day. So like cut out all my rambling.
No, you're good.
But, I guess I should caveat that with like, there totally is a healthy level of skepticism and there totally is, reasons to question and push back sometimes. Like that dialogue is important too. But I guess for me, this comes from a place of seeing reactions of, people who just forget that there's a human being behind, what they're lashing out against, and that maybe there's better ways to come together and work on the issues if we can find some common ground and work together. Like, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been called a Russian bot for trying to tell people that sometimes herbicides have a place in management.
Yeah.
Like just bringing that up nowadays, and we're constantly trying to use less and to be better. But at the end of the day, sometimes that's the tool we have, and we can, we try to use it in the most responsible way. But, so often when I would try to have that conversation in some spaces, it's like, oh, Monsanto owns you. And I'm like, no, I'm a human being who is just trying to, to work on this. And I want us to work together and not be, butting heads about this.
I'm right there with you. I've had that same experience. Like, I've unironically been called a shill, and I was like, really?
Same.
Really? I mean, seriously? Yeah, no, and that's great advice. Is maybe, normally I ask for a piece of advice, but actually that's the best. You already gave it. I mean, that's great advice. It is easy to lash out, but maybe stop and swallow your first reaction sometimes and think about why information is being presented in the way that it is.
Can I tell one last quick little
Yeah,
story?
absolutely.
So one of the coolest things that I've gotten to do is when I was in Hawaii and I was working on little fire ant issues. So little fire ant is an invasive ant, Wasmannia aeropunctata.
Hmm.
It's awful throughout the Pacific. I mean, it drives people off of farmlands
Yeah.
because they're just awful. And so when I was there, in the years that I was there, it had only been known on Big Island, but new populations were starting to pop up on Maui and Oahu. And in those days, we thought maybe these were incipient and maybe we could get a handle on them before it became as widespread as it was on Big Island. And so because it was such a problem on Big Island, there was a researcher there, Cass Vanderwood, who was like the expert on how to kind of, deal like on their biology and how to deal with them in the Pacific Islands. And so on Maui, it's new there. They're trying to educate the public, and these things are popping up on private lands, and they want to help the private landowner control them. And so, but understandably, there's a lot of people who don't want you coming on their property and just sprinkling out some kind of, pesticide.
Sure. Yeah.
But what they did, and so this was the Maui Invasive Species Committee in partnership with the Hawaii Ant Lab, led by Dr. Cass Vanderwoot. They went and just sat down with these homeowners, and Cass would just talk to them, and like every question they had, just sit there and talk until they felt comfortable or at least better understood. And it didn't always result in an agreement, but for the most part, it was just a really cool thing to get to be a part of, to sit with these homeowners and listen to the expert just take as much time as they needed to hear why this was important, what the treatments they were doing were, everything we knew about how those treatments could potentially impact their environment. And I think those types of things are time consuming, and they're in depth, but also impactful. And it was a really cool thing to be a part of, just to see these, people come together to talk about the issue and dispel that, big, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, down to the level of, I'm just a person who's dedicated my life to trying to figure out how to reduce the impact of these ants on these Pacific Islands. And let me tell you everything I know to make you feel better about us controlling them.
Yeah, that's
So,
super cool.
right.
That's super cool. And that's a great lesson for people on both sides of that situation. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if we want to get the message across, we have to be willing to spend the time and
Yeah.
the personal, like, one-on-one, face-to-face, and to deal with the skepticism, and to, like, we have
Mm-hmm.
to have a thick skin in the sciences sometimes because of these things. But like, if we really believe in the message that we're putting out there, we have to be willing to do the work. And
Totally.
yeah, I think that's real important. Very cool. Gosh, like, I still, like, I'm gonna have to have you back on because I think I still have so many questions for you. Uh, but yeah, I would like to have you on again and talk about maybe a couple of species in specific and just kind of
Yeah, I
dive
would
into
love that.
that. Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even really get into like why invasive species are bad in the sense of like, what they can do to natural systems. So it would be great to go over to really get like into the nitty gritty on a few and share how impactful they are. So
Yeah, let's do that for sure. We'll
yeah,
do.
yeah,
We're
that'd be
due for
awesome.
another deep dive episode, so we'll do that sometime soon.
Totally.
Well, Emily, I mean, again, thanks so much for coming on. It was fascinating. This stuff gets my brain going. I'm really excited, and I nerd out about this stuff too. But where can people find you? What are some places you'd like to point folks?
Yeah, totally. So please follow my organization. We're on the Florida Invasive Species Partnership is on Facebook. You can find us as the Florida Invasive Species Partnership. We're on Twitter as protect_Florida and Instagram protect_Florida. So yeah, please follow those. I kind of my Instagram is probably my personal most active like catalog of my Florida adventures. So if
Uh-huh.
you're interested in native plants and animals and the occasional dog and kid post, but it is mostly plants and animals. I am Emily Bell Photo on Instagram. And I'm on Twitter, Unbelievable. I'm new to it. I'm not like a SciCommer like you guys are. But I'm happy to meet you, and it's really cool to see the work, and it has been cool to meet new people through that. So I'm new to it, but trying to get better at tweeting and stuff.
Well, and I can highly recommend Emily's Instagram, and I believe you and your husband are both photographers. Like, you take beautiful photos.
Thank you. Yeah, so he does it as a living. He's a portrait photographer. He does
Okay.
people, but he's really into nature too. So yeah, Emily Bell Photo. He is actually. Let me give his wildlife
Yeah.
page because it's really cool. He just changed it. So Jensen Bell _ this wildlife is his, and he really does a lot of birds. He's really into birds, but he gets some other stuff too. So
Awesome.
yeah, I'm just a hobbyist. I just really for me, photography is a way to share what I think is really beautiful about my home and the places that I get to travel. So that's kind of my interest in it. But he does it for a living, so he's got to, make the
Oh yeah.
make the money on the
Oh yeah.
portrait.
No, and I'll oh for sure, and I'll share links to all that in the show notes too. But Emily, thanks again. That was great.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed that.
I'm super honored to be among the pantheon of incredible guests you've had. So thanks for having me.
Well, for sure. And thank y'all for listening. As always, y'all are the best. And I don't actually know what today is yet. You'll have found out at this point what today is. So y'all keep listening, keep being cool, keep being nice to each other. And we'll talk to you next time. Y'all be conscious of the way you talk to people and treat people, whether you are an educator or someone being educated. We have to find common ground. Make sure you're planting native and well-adapted plants, and maybe keep your pet kudzu at home. Y'all, thanks for listening. It is wonderful, as always, to have you be a part of this. I love you folks so much. We just recently hit 50,000 downloads. 50,000. Y'all, that's wild. It's wild. When I started this, I didn't think that would ever be able to happen. And it's all because of you cool people. Thanks so much to the Texas Tech Department of Plant and Soil Science for all the support and for even letting this thing happen. I could not do it without the support of my wonderful department. Get ready next week. We've got a solo episode about plants and trees and summer and all kinds of other things. I put a bunch of things on there because I don't actually know what it's going to be about yet, but it's going to be great. And I've got some great interviews coming up for you this fall, and I am really excited just to see where this goes over the next few months. I love you folks. Keep being good to each other, keep being kind, and keep being really cool plant people.